Hi folks, Matt Easton here. So, something that gets talked about occasionally in threads or after videos on YouTube about sword sharpness is the length of blade that was sharpened. And this comes up sometimes in relation to test cutting videos, sometimes gripping of the blade, whether it's grabbing someone else's blade or half swording your own blade. So it is something that comes up fairly often in a bunch of different sort of contexts. So I thought I'd run through some different sword types. First European, then I'll look at a couple of Asian swords and just talk about the length of the blade that was generally sharpened on that sword type. So first of all, we've got a sword from the sort of 12th, 13th century. Okay, this is a Deltin, not a replica I'm fond of, but gives you an idea of the sword type. So historically, this type of sword was usually sharpened for the entire length of the blade and of course the point on both edges. Okay, so they were usually sharpened all the way down to the base of the blade and they were usually very sharp. The expression razor sharp gets used quite a lot, but let's forget about razors and how they're sharpened, because of course a razor is a very thin piece of metal, very different to a sword. But what I'll say is, generally speaking, surviving examples of this type of broad-bladed medieval sword, one-handed sword, that survive with a decent edge on, that you can actually look at the edge sharpness and judge what kind of sharpness it would have been originally, and some of them still remain sharp. They are generally pretty sharp on both edges, all the way from the base, from the guard, all the way from the base of the blade, the fort here, all the way up the blade on both edges. And you know, similar kind of sharpness to a knife, shall we say, okay? Be it a Bowie knife or a kitchen knife or something else. So clearly it's a thicker piece of metal than most knives are, but they are usually very well sharpened all the way up. There is no blunt portion to the blade on this type of sword, usually. Okay, next up, this gets lots of attention, the European longsword. Lots of people assert that these were kept blunt on the base of the blade. Well, were they or weren't they? Yes and no. Usually, it seems that longswords were sharpened for all of their edge on both edges. However, there are, by the late medieval period when these are popular, so we're looking at 15th, 16th century, there are a variety of different longswords around. Some of them have what we call a ricasso at the base, and a ricasso is, as we'll see in a minute, by its very nature, blunt. Okay, a ricasso is blunt. So if they have a ricasso, yes, the ricasso is blunt. If, like most 15th century longswords, they have edges that go all the way down to the crossguard, they are, generally speaking, sharp on both edges all the way down to the base. However, the degree of sharpness can vary, and I think it's probably fair to say, and certainly when I sharpen my own swords, I concentrate on the portion of the blade that's usually going to cut, and that is from about the middle of the blade to the tip. Okay? Now, that's not to say that they were completely blunt in this lower half of the blade, the fort as we call it. They could still be sharp, but they might just not be as sharp as you would focus on the cutting section of the blade. Looking at historical examples, we can find some that are in the first couple of inches quite blunt. Blunt enough that you could put your finger over the quillon and not really worry about it. Certainly with a leather glove, it's not going to hurt you, and even without, as you can see with this one, I can do this, without a glove it's fairly comfortable. And I assure you this, I don't have anything to cut as a demo, but I can assure you this edge is sharp up here, and although it comes to an edge at the base, it's not sharp. Okay, so you don't need a ricasso to finger the guard, as it's called. So, but generally speaking, most of them were edged all the way down, but not necessarily really sharp down here, because there's not a lot of purpose in having the blade being very sharp down at the base here. Okay, then, as I mentioned, as we get into the end of the 15th century, 16th century, we start to get swords which have what are called a ricasso. And a ricasso is a dedicated blunt section at the base of the blade. Why was it there? Well, probably so that you could finger the guard, finger the cross. I can't do it with a basket hilt, but like I just showed with the longsword, it's probably so that you can more comfortably have the finger over the guard and apply pressure to the front of the blade there. So it's giving you a broader cross-sectional surface to apply pressure to. As you see, the design of this basket hilt prevents me from doing that properly here. Okay. And a ricasso is, as you can see, it's a completely blunt section. So you would normally, with this type of blade, sharpen it all the way down to the ricasso. And it's interesting to note that a lot of swords that have a ricasso, you start to get finger rings and other parts on the guard, on the hilt of the sword, that actually also prevent you sharpening the blade any further down. Okay, if we had finger rings on here, then I wouldn't be able to sharpen the blade any further down than the ricasso anyway. So the ricasso is a kind of chicken and egg. Which came first? It's possible that the finger rings and other complex guards actually kind of created the ricasso because you cannot physically sharpen a blade further down than the finger rings. Or it's possible that the ricasso developed before that. And in fact there are earlier medieval examples of ricasso, so we know that the ricasso did exist, but it wasn't widespread really before about the 1480s, 1490s. Okay, next up we have a military sabre, and this will go for also for all sort of 18th, 19th century swords. They were designed such that you could sharpen them down to about there. Beyond about that point, usually the fronts of the blades, and this is an example such, is too thick really to be able to sharpen. So physically you could sharpen a sabre all the way down to about there. However, it is notable that many military sabres were actually only sharpened from about there upwards. So they're really often only sharpened for the 2/3 of the blade up to the point. Okay, and this portion of the blade, which was used for parrying and parrying on the edge, as was absolutely normal for most of European history and was absolutely taught as a fixed solid thing that you must parry with your front edge with sabre, that was kept blunt because frankly if you're only parrying with that and you're not hitting anyone with it, why sharpen it? Okay, so they were really only sharpened from about a third of the way up for the rest of the 2/3 of the blade. Okay, occasionally when you find sharpened examples, they're actually only sharpened from about halfway up, or sometimes only in the last third. Okay, and that brings me to my final European example and sword type, and that is the thrusting swords that appear really in the second half of the 19th century and become quite popular in various parts of Europe, and often they are only sharpened really in the last third of blade. So they're really very thrust-centric swords, and this section of the blade, certainly on the British 1895, like I'm holding here, is a bar essentially. That's a parrying bar, and then you've got a skewering point which you sharpen on both edges, front and back. And then some officers had them sharpened a little bit further down so that you can have some capacity to give light cuts with them as well. Okay, so going through those European swords, I hope that's shown there's a variety of different lengths of sharpening on them. Sometimes certain types of swords, and I should also mention, going back to the longsword, if we look at Filippo Vardi's treatise, a lot of people quote him because he talks about sharpening just the tip of a longsword, but he's specifically talking about a longsword for armoured fighting. So what he does is he has the whole blade blunt to enable easier half-swording, and then really only sharpens the tip because you're only really thrusting when you're half-swording, you're aiming in gaps in armour. So there were specialised types of sword in the medieval and Renaissance period where they did only sharpen certain parts of the blade for certain purposes. And in fact in Vienna, in the museum in Vienna, there's actually a half-swording sword which is like a normal longsword, but it actually has dedicated blunt sections on the blade for you, they're actually like ricassos in themselves, for you to grip very securely in half-swording. Not to say that you can't half-sword with a normal longsword, of course you can, and we talk about this all the time in my videos. You can grab a sharp blade like I'm doing here and steer the point completely comfortably. However, inevitably, if that blade is dedicated blunt for half-swording, you're going to have an even stronger and more secure grip on it. So there were types of sword where they only sharpened portions of the blade for specific purposes. Okay, but equally, if we go right the way through the European sword kind of lineage, you can see that generally speaking, most edges are sharpened for almost their full length, front and back if they have two edges, and front if they have one edge. Now just looking briefly at a couple of Asian swords, we'll pick two of the most popular and successful Asian swords, the Indian tulwar and the Japanese katana. The Japanese katana, very simple one, they are pretty much always edged, very, very sharp down the front edge. Most Japanese swords do not have any kind of back edge or false edge. There are some that do, but I won't talk about them now. They're usually fully edged, fully sharp, all the way down to the brass habaki there at the base. Okay, so clearly with that type of tsuba, with that kind of guard, you can't finger the guard, or you can't really get your hand up beyond there unless you go half swording conveniently. So it's not there for that purpose. It's really just there to bolster the hilt against the blade. That brass fitting is just holding the making the blade secure against the hilt, and also it's partly because the tang is very wide on a katana. It's almost as wide as the blade, so it's giving a sort of a shoulder for the hilt to sit against. Okay, so they're edged all the way down, but if we go to the Indian tulwar, they are not. They sometimes are, I should say, but they're usually not. If we look at this one, hopefully you can see in the light, stepping between swords here, you'll see that it has a ricasso, and this is sometimes known as the Indian ricasso. And this is very, very common on tulwars, and they're usually sharpened down to a point here, and it might possibly be because occasionally they fingered the cross, fingered the guard with tulwars. However, I think it was probably something that evolved incidentally, because if you look at the hilt of the tulwar, try and get it there, you'll see it has these languettes, as they're called, that sit either side of the scabbard and prevent rain going in the scabbard and hold it secure on the scabbard. And you'll notice that the sharpened portion of the blade comes down pretty much level with where the languettes start or finish, depending how you look at it. And that's pretty much always the case with tulwars. So I think that what happened is actually they decided to make this hilt style, and then sharpening the blade down to that point was all they could do, because you can't get the angle on the stone to sharpen the blade where those languettes stick out. So inevitably where the languettes are, you can't have a sharpened edge. So I think that's the main reason for the ricasso on an Indian sword. So just to show, there we go, we've got both European and Asian swords. Some are fully edged, some have a blunt part at the base of the blade, some are edged more in the 2/3 of the blade to the point and are not kept very sharp in the base of the blade. But I hope that gives you a general idea of the varieties of length of edge sharpening. And I will just reiterate again, in regards to medieval swords, because this comes up so often, in regards to medieval swords, they were usually fully edged on both edges if they had two edges, or all the way up their front edge if they only had one edge. Okay, they were usually fully edged and they were sharp. Okay, cheers.